There's a death row inmate who we've executed over a dozen times. He won't stay dead. We killed Joseph Glass for the first time on August 18th, 1999. I knew he was a strange case since day one. Never seen a guy so happy to die before. It was like we were doing him a favor. He refused the automatic appeal. He refused to be seen by a chaplain. He just wanted it over with. It had only taken a little over a year, and it was already time for him to make his appointment with God. He freaked me out, just passing by his cell. He was like our very own Hannibal Lecter, the way he just stood there in the back of his cell, like he'd been waiting for you. The lights always burned out in any cell he was in, and maintenance had gotten tired of fixing them. Not that he seemed to mind in the slightest. The darkness seemed to swallow his top half, and all I could see were the whites of his beady little eyes poking out of all that black. Billy drummed his baton against the bars. Up and at him, cowpoke, he called in that mocking tone. Time finally come for you to pay what you owe. You sick son of a Billy. Warden Taft silenced him with a word. If you can't act like a professional, you're going to have to sit this one out. Billy paused and licked his chapped lips. No, he muttered. This a show I can't miss. Glass seemed to tick Billy off more than any prisoner before him. He liked them to at least pretend to feel sorry for what they've done, or act scared of what's coming to them. This one didn't even have the common decency to shed a tear. He was as stone-faced as a statue, even while being marched to the chair. Billy liked to joke sometimes that we ought to take the guy out back with some car batteries and really put the fear of God into him, get him to cut out that stoic act. I think he was only half joking. After what this guy did to those girls. Well, Billy has a daughter, so I guess it struck a chord. We all watched him fry. The warden, his closest men. The thin-faced man representing the commissioner of corrections. The prison physician. The families of those poor girls. It couldn't have gone more by the book. Only oddity I'd noticed at the time was that the stench of death never quite left the clothes I'd worn that day. And then the next morning, we came into work to see the whites of those beady little eyes staring at us from the darkness again. Good morning, sirs, he said, just as he did every morning, in that airy, hoarse little voice. I'll admit it. I dropped everything I was carrying, stumbled back, stammered like a confused child. Hell, I almost screamed. You're not. Why, you're supposed to be. I don't know what you mean, sir. He leaned in like he was trying to stare a hole through my chest. His tone almost sounded disappointed. You never came for me. You promised me that yesterday would be the end, sir, but you never came. I waited all night long. Why did you lie to me? Me and Taft looked at each other. We both had the exact same question on our minds. If Glass was still alive, who the hell did we roll into the morgue last night? Jesus Christ, Taft gagged when he pulled back the cadaver cover, stumbling away. It's Billy. I looked. I know I shouldn't have, but I couldn't help it. And I'll be forever haunted by the sight of my friend lying there on his back, mouth agape and cloudy eyes staring into the ceiling, open wide as if he'd spent his last moments in a state of terror. The public never found out what happened. The cover-up story was that poor Billy had been taken by cardiac arrest. Internally, it was the scandal to end all scandals. Worst case of incompetence and negligence in history, they called it. They brought the hammer down on anyone even tangentially involved. Me and Taft were out on our ears, and they would have prosecuted us too, but that would have required admitting it ever happened. But I just could never wrap my head around it. Of those dozens of witnesses, not a single person noticed we were strapping a guard to the chair, not an inmate. It was impossible to the point of absurdity. Glass had been the man in that chair. I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Some months later, I noticed power flickering off all over the city one evening. It was brief, so I thought nothing of it, at least until I got a call from a familiar number the very next morning. I understand you were one of the staff who regularly worked with one Joseph Glass. We would like to consult with you about an evolving situation. Oh, at PM yesterday, we attempted the execution of Joseph Glass for the second time. There was a long pause, and when the voice returned, the professionalism had melted away, replaced with a baffled anxiety. And, well, it didn't. It didn't work. I blinked. It didn't? What? There came a long sigh. Perhaps. It'd be best if you saw for yourself, and just like that, me and Taft had our jobs back. Officially, Joseph Glass had been successfully executed on August 18th, 1999. Unofficially, they tried again 6 months later, just to tie up loose ends. This time, he hadn't even had the courtesy to pretend to die. He just sat there on the chair, motionless and unaffected, while the who'd flipped the switch suddenly seized up and began to convulse, screaming and gnashing and wailing as electricity seared him beneath his skin, clawing at his chest until his eyes popped in his skull and rolled down his face like melted candle wax. All around him, lights flickering, machines bursting from pressure, electrical panels vomiting arcs of static. It was a mess. The feds were crawling all over this case now, from a department I've never heard of. Something about investigating preternatural activity. They told me Glass was refusing to speak with anybody, but the co's who'd once cared for him. Being walked into that interrogation room almost made me feel like I, myself, was a convict being marched to his execution. Glass was staring at me when I walked in, like he'd been sat there, motionless, waiting for me. I expected nothing less. I took a shuddering breath as I sat across from him. I'd sat across from serial killers and psychos before and showed no hint of fear. But how could I not? Now, sitting across from a man who can kill people without touching them. Glass, Officer Mendez, his tone betrayed no emotion. I had thought you'd abandoned me. I winced. No, Glass, I'd just been temporarily relieved. It's good to see you again. Would you like a glass of water? I offered it to him. He didn't even look at it. His eyes just bored into mine, relentless. I'm here to ask you a few questions. Silence. Okay? Glass, I need to know. How you killed Billy and Kramer. I didn't, he replied. The thing standing behind you. I didn't bother to turn around. I had enough experience with prisoners trying to trick me into looking the other way while they pulled off some half-baked escape plan. Glass, please. Let's take this seriously, I replied. I've always treated you with respect, haven't I? You've never had any problems with me. Actually, I do. I have a problem with all of you. Oh, you here all believe that. Death is a punishment. There was the first hint of emotion I'd ever heard in his voice. It's not. It's freedom, the only freedom. You promised me that gift. You promised me you'd let me die. You've given it to so many other prisoners while leaving me behind, with all of your machines and your science and your knowledge. Surely you can find a way, if anyone. My throat felt suddenly dry. I had to take a sip of the water myself and hoped it would quell my burning nerves. We're trying our best, Glass. But you have to work with us. It may help if you told us. What exactly is preventing us from executing you? He moved for the first time, leaning in, so slow as to be almost imperceptible. It won't let me die, and that's when I felt a hand settle on my shoulder from behind. Everything stopped. My lungs stopped inflating. I swear, my heart stopped beating, and my blood froze in place in my veins, and it all felt so cold. I could see the hand in the corner of my eyes, long and veiny and black. I could feel the breath on the back of my neck. I'd once mocked the way deers froze in headlights. Now I understood. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. I couldn't think. I couldn't even take a single breath. Even as my lungs began to cry out for air, and my vision blurred, and my thoughts melded together, all I could see was Joseph's eyes staring into mine. Those infinite fathoms of darkness, that Stygian sea that swirled and stormed and thundered in the blackness of his iris, and the eyes of things waiting a million leagues below the waters. And I would have suffocated there, too terrified to even breathe, if those agents in black had not called off the interrogation then and come storming into the room. Later, they showed me the tapes from the security camera. There'd been nothing behind me, nothing placing its thin hand upon my shoulder, nothing at all. On May 7th, 2001, Glass was set to be executed for the third time via hanging, or so I heard in some government black site somewhere, far from prying eyes. While it was set to happen, me and Taft were sharing glasses of scotch in his office, nominally to celebrate, really because we were scared. Taft always struck me as young at heart despite his years, but this was the first time the warden had ever looked truly, properly old. He watched the yard below as he had a drink. "Did I ever tell you why I chose this line of work, Mendez?" I shook my head, and he sighed. Back in '63, they found a woman's body in the back seat of a burnt-out car in some state park near my neighborhood. A prostitute. One of her Johns had chopped her up, burned all the evidence. And you know what got me, Mendez? Nobody cared. Nobody bothered to investigate. Who'll notice one less hooker on the corner of Fifth Avenue, right? It didn't sit right with me. The way I see it, Mendez, every life matters. Even the ones we try and cast aside. Everybody's got people who love them, and childhood memories, and all that. Everybody deserves justice. No matter who they were, he set down his glass and looked me in the eyes. So I joined the force, got the case reopened, found the guy, and I watched him fry. And I like to imagine she was there watching too. As he burned, there was a tense moment, and then a chuckle. Course, after that bullet to the hip in '71, I couldn't walk the beat anymore. But I've been just as happy here, watching justice be served. It makes me feel like there's some kind of karmic order to the world. Good deeds and bad deeds get repaid in kind. It was clear there was something lurking beneath his words, some unspoken thesis. Eventually, with old, wrinkled, tired eyes, he said it. "I've thought about it, and if Glass doesn't die tonight, I'm finally going to retire, Mendez," he confessed. "After what he did to those girls, what kind of order can there be in a world where a monster like that is just? Beyond justice?" I was shocked. Warden Taft always struck me as an unmoving fixture. What would we do without him? "He'll die, sir," I promised. "It'll work this time." It has to. But he seemed deeply uncertain. With one last shuddering drink, he leaned forward. His eyes, he stared at my expression, as if desperate for me to understand, for me to know. Those things. In his eyes. Haven't you seen them? And at that moment, Taft was yanked up out of his chair. It was so sudden, so inexplicable, I could barely register what I was witnessing. Some unseen force lifted him 2 or 3 feet above the ground, dangling him there. He choked, coughed and sputtered, desperate to gasp down air which would not come, and clawed at something around his neck which I could not see. He was hanging, I realized. And with wide, horrified eyes the same as Billy's had been, he silently begged me for help. I sprang from my chair and wrapped my arms around his dangling legs. At first, I tried to pull him down to the floor, but I realized it was only tightening the invisible noose around his neck. Then I tried lifting him as high as I could, which gave him some relief, but not much. Tears rolled down his face as it swelled and turned blue, and even though I could not see the noose, I could see the bruised purple skin where it had squeezed around his neck. All the while I screamed myself hoarse. Help! Somebody, please? Jesus Christ, we need help in here. But nobody came. And all of a sudden, some unseen force seemed to sweep my feet out from under me. I dropped like a bag of bricks, but I was so startled I maintained my grip around the warden's legs. I fell and yanked him down with me, and his body suddenly jolted with a sickening crack. It took me a while to manage the courage to look up at him. His neck had been stretched far too long, and his head was bent to the side at almost a 90-degree angle. Eyes wide, round and bloated tongue hanging from dry lips. And then whatever force had suspended him disappeared, and his body fell upon me while I screamed and screamed. I came bursting from his office to find my coworkers casually chatting and working just outside. Somehow, despite all my screaming and begging while Taft was dying, none of them had heard a thing. I took a page from Taft. I wanted out. We were dealing with something unholy here, something whose tendrils could reach any distance, and my life, who knows, maybe even my soul was at hazard. But the agents in the sharp suits made one thing clear. If I refused to cooperate, well, I would make the perfect scapegoat for the murder of Warden Taft. I was marched into the interrogation room to find a Joseph Glass that had abandoned all pretense of humanity. His eyes had darkened to a pure black. Or perhaps he had no eyes at all, only windows into some place of outer darkness. I was shaking like a leaf as I sat in front of him, feeling more like a prisoner than he was. Mr. Glass. No reply. I shuddered, trying to focus on my little piece of paper to distract myself from the blackness of his eyes. I have some questions I'm supposed to ask you. Is that okay? Silence. I take a deep breath. How old are you, Glass? I thought it was just one of those basic questions. Conversation starters, really. I couldn't have prepared myself for his answer. I am old, child. His voice was nothing like I remembered. It was deep and low and rumbling, like there were multiple people speaking in unison, and all were equally ancient. Older than you could possibly know. Older than this nation, and older even than the empire that once bore it. I had to fight the basic animal instinct to flee. Focus on the questions, I thought. Why did you do what you did to those girls? Just so I could feel something again, he whispered. Anything did you not feel the slightest bit of? Guilt? Remorse? You ask that? Of me? Me, who has watched empires rise and fall. He almost sounded amused. Does time feel remorse? For time has killed far more than I. But mankind is like the Hydra. All I've killed will be replaced by, essentially, identical stock, and in greater numbers. And then they will die and be replaced. And so the cycle will continue forever. Did you expect me to pity them for being given the death I myself covet? Only the dead are given leave of the cycle. It is a blessing, and suddenly he stood from his chair, as if he'd never been restrained at all. A blessing you promised me, Officer Maindis. I stared up at him in disbelief. How did you? But I couldn't even stammer a sentence out before he was upon me, crawling over the table with the eerie grace of a spider. These were no longer the imperceptible hints of emotions I'd come to expect. It was like a switch had been flipped. Tears streamed down his cheeks, snarling with genuine rage, hurt, betrayal. And beneath those black seas in his eyes, All the things that haunted the fathoms below were rising to the surface. You owe me a death. Make good on your word. Pay your debt. I cried out and recoiled from his every touch with disgust, but he was stronger than he looked. I couldn't worm my way out of his impossible grip. I won't. Get off of me, you sick bastard. Do it. Pay me what you owe. It was like 1,000 different voices screaming in my ear. Straining and weeping, I locked my hands around his neck and pressed my thumbs against his throat, trying to strangle him. But instead, I could just feel that grip upon my own neck, squeezing the life out of myself as my lungs burned for air. Yet I kept pressing harder and harder, as if hoping I might somehow break through whatever unholy force was protecting him. And then those terrible hands grasped my shoulders again, and I was paralyzed by a terror that could be called nothing but ancient and primal. Like the thing standing behind me was the same force that had kept my ancestors huddled terrified in their caves 100,000 years ago, and every one of those voices was crying out to me through my very blood. And it pulled me from my chair, threw me as though I were weightless. And the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the infirmary. Once more, none of this was captured on the security camera. In the footage, I just enter the room and have a seat with strange, almost robotic movements. And then the both us just sit there, staring at each other, without speaking, without moving, without blinking, for an hour. After this, Joseph Glass entered a catatonic state, and from then on refused to converse with even me. Now that my usefulness had ended, the agents discarded me like yesterday's trash. Don't even seem to care if I tell anybody. Who would believe me? I thought I'd gotten lucky, that my nightmare was over. I couldn't have been more wrong. Go sorting through any public records, and you won't find a single mention of the name Joseph Glass. They've squirreled him away in that off-the-books black site and scrubbed away every other trace of him. I'd say he'd been unpersoned, if indeed he could ever be called a person at all. But they're still trying every execution method in the book. I don't know quite why. Maybe it's for research. I'm sure the US military would love to find the secret to making its men as unkillable as Glass. And besides, they're not the ones who have to deal with the consequences. On June 3, 2005, they tried a firing squad. I know this because me and my wife were out on our second honeymoon, slow dancing by the lake at night to our favorite song, when I felt a wetness against my chest. I looked down to see her eyes as gray and dull as foggy glass, and her chest shredded to Swiss cheese by rounds that made no sound. On December 23, 2012, they tried lethal injection. That was the day they found my son's car wrapped around a tree, and baffled coroners discovered that he was dead before the accident even occurred, his bloodstream polluted with pavilon and potassium chloride. It's been years since I've isolated myself from everyone I knew, hermiting away in this cabin out in the middle of nowhere, and yet the stench of death still follows me. Just a couple years ago, I found a news report mentioning my nephew. Apparently, he'd been found completely exsanguinated, his veins emptied utterly despite no signs of a struggle. God knows what kind of arcane methods of execution they're trying by now. He's not going to let me walk away from this. Not while I still owe him a debt. But I've been doing some research too. Research into those untold legions of things I witnessed staring up from that blackened sea in Glass's eyes. I've learned things men were not meant to know. Practiced rites, assembled tools, ingredients. And I think I know where they're keeping him. Even though they blindfolded me, I counted the second between every turn on our way to the black site, and I've since spent weeks watching the place, cataloging every entry point. Maybe I'm slipping into madness. Or maybe I've truly found the way to put an end to the horror. To finally give this monster the justice that Taft would have wanted for him. Joseph Glass had been right about one single thing. I have to pay what I owe, even if it kills me. Story 2. My coworkers and I live in fear of winning a certain award. This year, I was the nominee. I stared, mouth dry, heart pounding, at the message from my boss, that awful combination of words that my coworkers and I pray we never see. You're in the running for Employee of the Year. For him to send something so callous via email, that was just rubbing salt in the wound. My eyes glazed over the wall of text that followed. I didn't need to read the details. I'd cleaned enough of the prior winners off the walls and ceiling of the soundproofed break room to know exactly what the award entailed. After that initial, deep pang of fear faded, denial flooded in to take its place. I wasn't just hitting my sales quota, I was blowing it out of the damn water selling big-ticket items daily. I never forgot to place the stickers with my barcode on the products, either, so when my customers checked out, and it was scanned at the register, the sales should have automatically been linked to my employee ID. We don't receive commission. There are other incentives to keep our sales up. I hadn't been watching the numbers because I knew I was making sales left and right. I would have never even dreamt that I was at risk. It was just a glitch with our computer system, I decided with a nervous laugh. It had to be something IT could probably sort out in no time. When I finally regained control of my legs, I wobbled to my manager's office. There was no miscalculation, he assured me. It was my employee ID that ranked at the bottom. The barcodes never lie, Graham. He didn't even bother making eye contact. I was circling the drain figuratively, and if I didn't get my shit together, literally soon enough. I begged him to review the camera footage. I knew he'd be able to see me making all those sales. Don't worry, he added, with a smile vacant of anything remotely resembling happiness. One way or another, we all contribute to the success of our company. I suppose that by then, he was long desensitized to the pleas of the desperate. As I left his office, I assured myself that this wasn't a death sentence. Not yet. I had another month until they recalculated our final standings before shit would get real. Before I'd be given a limp handshake and an empty, "Thank you for your devotion to the company," as I was led down the hallway. Before I'd meet what lives behind the usually padlocked door in the shadowy corner of the break room. Before I'd learn what it truly meant to sacrifice myself for the good of the company. Word spread fast around the office. Kevin gave me his smug, shit-eating grin. Maybe he thought that with me out of the picture, he'd finally have a shot with Elise. Elise. I just desperately hoped that hers wouldn't be the name drawn afterwards, the one selected to hose what's left of me off the break room floor and down the stained, rusty drain. As required, I began parking in my new designated space at the far end of the employee lot, the faded sign indicating reserved for Employee of the Year, nearly swallowed up by the encroaching tree line. It added an extra 10 minutes to my walk to our store, and I dreaded that added time in the oppressive Texas heat. The rational part of me knew that was soon to be a moot point, though. One way or another, in another month, I wouldn't have that parking spot. If I were lucky, I'd live to see another summer, live to see some other poor bastard's car parked there. If they hadn't already heard the news, when the rest of my coworkers saw my car in that space, they knew what it meant. Don't get too attached. They started avoiding me like the plague. I didn't blame them. We all knew what would be coming next if my sales didn't improve. It's the same thing that happens every time. We'd gather for the mandatory meeting on the closing night of the fiscal year. All eyes on the sorry son of a bitch that had won the room so quiet that you could hear their muffled sobs. They'd receive what barely constituted a handshake from my manager, while he muttered dead-eyed his appreciation for their devotion to the company. Next, they'd be ushered off to the break room to meet corporate. No one tried to run, not after what happened in 19. Instead, the winner would always turn back, shooting us a desperate, final look, eyes pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. And of course, no one ever did. Once the door closed behind them, and that soundproofed room swallowed up the last of their sobbing, begging it was over, the rest of us would be sent home, and I'd try to shower away that disgusting feeling, that sick sense of relief that someone else was sent to their death, and not me. Cal, the nicest guy I'd ever met, he was the bottom performer 2 years ago. He'd fallen so ill that he'd nearly wasted away and eventually couldn't work anymore. He must have thought that freed him from his contract if he left. If he never came back into work, he'd be okay. He must not have read the fine print in our hiring paperwork. Although, to be fair, if any of us had read it, we'd never have signed it in the first place. Cal was a warning to the rest of us that there is no quitting in our line of work. If they have to track you down and find you, and I promise you that they will find you well, wouldn't you prefer to go with your dignity, with the company compensating your loved ones, rather than be pulled from your home, kicking and screaming into the night? Gina was Employee of the Year in 2023. Gina, with the kind smile, whom Kevin had set his sights on before Elise, and, just like Elise, she wanted nothing to do with him. I still remember that day, the day they released the final numbers. The way Gina's mouth hung open in confusion, shock. When she finally managed to form words again, she too insisted that there must be some mistake. We all vouched for her to management. I'd personally seen her make so many sales. Our manager simply reminded us that the barcodes never lie. My name was the one drawn for breakroom duty that next morning to pick up what remained of her smile and her simple gold wedding band to be returned to her family. In one business week, they received a box containing a check and everything left of her that wouldn't fit down the drain. Once the numbers are finalized, once your employee barcode has been slapped on that innocuous-looking pink slip, well, your fate is sealed. Kevin, in all his years at the company, has never parked on the far side of the lot. He has never even come close to becoming Employee of the Year, even though he couldn't sell a bottle of water to a man dying of dehydration. He is sleaze incarnate and doesn't even have the charisma to mask it. I never understood how he did so well, but I couldn't afford to think about him. I had myself to worry about, and the glitch in the system. Any time I found myself in the break room, that ancient wooden door was an unwelcome reminder of the impending one-way trip it held for me. I took special care to keep an eye on my sales, working my ass off, pulling double shifts. I pulled up the numbers as the end of month drew near, and couldn't believe it. I was still dead last. Somehow, there were days where less than half of my sales had been recorded to my employee number. I didn't understand. I waited for the opportunity to sneak into the manager's office and pull the footage myself. I'd show the boss that something had gone wrong with the calculations, that the system was broken. I finally got my chance. At first, I triumphantly watched myself make sale after sale far more than had been credited to my account. For the first time in a month, I felt a sense of relief. I had evidence, and that had to count for something. I switched feeds to the camera nearer to the registers so I could confirm that the codes were being scanned. I'd seen several scanned successfully and reached to turn off the recording. That's when I saw it. Saw him. Kevin. It was subtle. I didn't realize what he was doing at first until I recognized the pattern. Even then, I had to rewind and watch again for it to click. It happened for nearly half of my sales that day. I saw him intercepting the customers before they could check out, before I could get credit for my sales. And while he chatted them up, he discreetly slapped his employee barcode over my own. I confronted him that night. I was furious. He just smiled, smugly gave me that line about how the barcodes never lie. He didn't give a shit that he was sentencing someone else to death. Hell, maybe he even enjoyed it. Kevin had stolen credit for Gina's sales and God knows who else's. Fucking Kevin. The day our numbers were to be finalized, he had the audacity to place his barcode over mine on a huge sale he made no attempt at hiding it right in front of me. He flashed me a grin as he did. I caught up with the customers before they checked out, and they kindly allowed me to peel the sticker off. I stuck it in my pocket to show my manager. I pulled the video too, and I stormed into his office, refused to leave until he watched it. I studied him as his eyes moved across the screen, and if he was upset or shocked, he certainly didn't show it. Finally, he met my eyes, and at the sight of the pain in his well, for the first time, I felt a sense of relief, until I realized why he looked so miserable. Until he whispered, "I'm sorry, Graham. Someone has to receive that award tomorrow." It's out of my hands. I wordlessly handed him the damn barcode sticker of Kevin's that I'd peeled off. He studied it for a long moment before he handed it back to me with a mirror. "Why don't you hold on to this?" I told Elise what had happened over lunch, and as much as I appreciated her outrage on my behalf, I was already resigned to it. I'd mainly wanted to warn her, because I had a sick feeling she'd be the one Kevin went after next. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't devastated when, that night, my boss called me into his office and informed me of the final standings. Yeah, I knew it was coming, but I guess it's just human nature to hold on to denial hope until the bitter end. For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other in silence. The presence of the pink slip of paper lying on the desk between us said more than enough. Finally, my eyes drifted down to the form. He'd already signed, but the space where my barcode the series of vertical lines spelling out my death sentence should have been placed was empty. I never knew how this part went, since it always took place behind closed doors. No one that ever filled out that form lived to tell the rest of us about it. "I need you to place a barcode here before I send the form to corporate," he said eventually. I opened my mouth for one final, impassioned plea for my life, but he interrupted me. He spoke each word slowly, softly. "I'm leaving the room now. I need you to place a barcode here before I send the form to corporate." He stared at me for a long moment, waiting for my barely perceptible nod of acknowledgement before leaving me alone in the office. They processed the paperwork and announced the Employee of the Year that next day. Yes, I did feel a pang of guilt as I watched the smug grin fade, the blood drain from Kevin's face as he stared in shock at the outstretched hand of our manager as he was thanked for his devotion to our company. I felt it again as I watched him plead all the way to the break room, as our manager spoke to him the same mantra we'd all heard before. The barcodes never lie. But I thought of Gina, of the countless others, and by the time I heard the door slam behind him, the guilt was already gone. In its place, the relief of knowing the rest of us were safe. Well, at least until next year. Story 3. There is a customer none of us are allowed to serve. I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno. Diner name has of course been changed for obvious reasons, more on that later. Why do I work at the Lone Star Diner, off the road from Carson City to Reno? Well, because, kind stranger, my life plans didn't work out. Generally, if you're caught working at a diner past college specifically, one in the middle of nowhere, it might mean that things aren't going so hot. But still, why this diner? Why Lone Star specifically? I'm aware you probably aren't actually asking these questions, but I nonetheless believe they deserve a response. Of all of the diners in the world, what makes Lone Star so special is the pay. The pay is fucking great. There are maybe 10 other diners within a 30-minute drive from where I live. Most of them average out to a little over minimum wage. Meanwhile, Lone Star is whipping up a mean 50-hour. And that hourly rate is due to one single solitary reason, no matter what anyone tells you. Because of him. My first day on the job was fine, more or less. I'd worked customer service before, so I felt like I could run with the strange surprises that came unique to diners. I was able to adapt to the inconsistency of the rules pretty quickly. Unwritten rules like some areas in the restaurant need to be spotless at all times. Others, boss lady couldn't give less of a shit about. Serve customers quickly. But not too quickly, asshole. Customers here don't actually like it when you show up too fast. Give them some time to feel the floor under their boots, to miserably stare ahead and mourn what could have been. Yick no diner stuff. They're here because they want to be alone. Pardon the contradiction. Of course, vaguely defined, whispered only by ghosts' roles extended to the cooks as well. If you were somehow, secretly, celebrity chef Marco Pierre White in the flesh, your mandate was to keep your damn prowess to yourself. Your job is to make the classics as decently as possible. Not bad, but not amazing. Just poor enough to be really good. That's what the customers are here for. As the weeks unfolded, I rose, or I suppose crouched to the occasion quite well. You want intentional, pinpoint precision mediocrity. You've come to the right person. Most of the patrons just wanted coffee and brunch, brought to them at medium speed, with a semi-predictable cadence of waiter or waitress check-ins afterwards. Done, done, and done. Not one for subtlety. One day, I finally decided to ask my boss the question in the middle of a shift. I didn't want to ruin a good thing by doubting it, but fuck me if I wasn't a little curious. Not a full look at the gift horse's mouth, more of a skeptical side eye. Why 50 her? She didn't even look up from her task at the register, methodically counting out bills. Said it on your first day. You gotta be good at following the rules. And when it's an important rule, you'd better be damn well perfect. High expectations here, I made a face. Right. High expectations. You think I'm joking? No, ma'am, I guess. Why did I even speak up? I just think you're running a really cool operation here. Cooler than you might realize. It's still work, but the whole thing seems fair? Christ, my waffling skills were abysmal. Add that to the list of intentional mediocrity. Boo-yeah. She looked up from her duties and shot me a stern look. I don't run this ship, and following the rules here means that you take care of yourself. I'm sorry? I'm your employer, sure, and I'll pay you well to be here, sure, but you should be aware there is plenty more going on here than just you in this diner. She glanced down at her watch, then sighed. I usually save this speech for the end of the month, but you already caught me halfway through it. So, the Coles notes, if you don't think you have it in you to follow instructions clearly, without protest, and without asking too many questions, then you should leave. Quit. No harm, no foul. A week's worth of pay on the house. The conversation sputtered shortly after that. I tried to find an opening to ask more about what she meant, but she was closed off to the topic moving forward. And you know what? That was fine if she wanted me to put my head down and just do the work. I could do that. And work I did. And things were good. Mundane small talk with the customers was fun. My coworkers were friendly, and I was getting paid well. I'd found a place to park the failures of my life. A place to build from. It must have been a Saturday, I think, when I first noticed him. An occupied seat in the far corner of the diner. No idea how long he'd been sitting there and waiting, though he certainly looked patient. I had the strange inkling that he'd been left hanging for quite some time, though I couldn't actually remember seeing him enter. Brown corduroy shirt. Short hair. Mid-50s, it seemed. A reasonably calm smile. Normal-looking dude. I started making my way out from the back and headed towards him. Immediately, I felt a tight grip on my arm. It was Melanie, my boss, with a forceful clutch enough to make me drop my notepad. Her fingers tightened around my forearm, sharply pinching my skin. "Important rules," she said. "What? You remember our chat about rules? Well, this is the most important one. Okay, okay, that man over there in the corner." She motioned to the man who had caught my attention sitting upright, hands softly clasped together, coy smile across his face. "You don't go up to him. You don't say a word to him, but he's a customer?" Her hold intensified. She was hurting me, almost as if she was taking out some sort of unseen anger on me. "I'd like to ask you right now to be smart enough to not ask questions and just follow instructions. You don't go to his table. You don't talk to him. You can look at him. You can shout across the room at him if you'd like, though I can't imagine why you'd ever need to do that. But you do not approach him, and you do not take his order, or a sharp exhale through the nose, a shake of the head, and a glare from my manager. It's different every time. But it ain't pretty. I watched him from the short distance I'd been afforded. It was hard not to. She did too. Unlike the other customers here, I didn't get a sense that he was here to be alone, to reminisce, or to take part in the comfort ritual of a lackluster Eggs Benedict over rye. Instead, I had the sense that he was just curious. Mild-mannered, content, but curious. My shift ended not too long after, so I didn't actually get a chance to watch him leave. Regardless, the experience of seeing him and learning about the rule he was connected to left a bizarre, dampening feeling on my mood. I liked my job. I liked coming home and unwinding. I didn't mind being in the middle of nowhere. It felt nice to look up at the empty sky filled with stars, to see them shimmer and shine and even occasionally shoot across. I made a wish that things in my life would stay simple. I started to get a sense of his cadence. He'd usually show up once a month. The rare times I got to see him, I'd try to squeak in the odd question to my boss. Questions like, who is he? Where does he come from? And has anyone spoken with him? All mechanically met with, I don't know, and if you're scared, you're welcome to quit. Then, as fate would have it, one day boss lady fell incredibly ill. My coworkers and I had to convince her to go home midway through her shift, her sickness falling, uncomfortably, within the usual 1-3 day window at the end of the month when our customer would typically appear. And of course, there he was, right after she went home. To my benefit, the other waiters and waitresses working the rounds were well aware of his presence and knew exactly what to do whenever he arrived. All of them knew to steer clear of him. Nevertheless, driven by a foundational curiosity that I just couldn't shake, I used this opportunity to go for it. I shouted a single thing across the floor, knowing Melanie wasn't there to chide me. "Hello, sir. What brings you here?" I asked him. He turned his head from his fixed position in his seat and put a hand to his ear. "Clever." I said, "What brings you here?" I called out again, a few notches louder this time, garnering some odd looks from our Thursday patrons. To my surprise, he spoke back. I'm not sure why I was expecting his voice to carry the tone of some twisted, demented demon, maybe the fear Melanie had instilled in me. The man sounded exactly how he looked. "I'm sorry, dear," he said. "I'm afraid I'm not sure what you're saying. Can you come over here and ask me again?" Nope. I was good. "And I don't mean to be rude about the service," he continued, "but it feels as if no one has taken my order for quite some time now." I let the exchange end there, diverting my attention back to the other guests. As always, he'd eventually disappear without fanfare, without the clatter of the entrance bell or any sight or sound of his steps across the diner floor, our backroom conversations about him remaining dreadfully short while he was there just, he's here, and he's gone, and the odd. When we really needed to say it, I feel really weird about this. It took me a while to understand where my brazenness to address this strange middle-aged man came from. In truth, I was just afraid. His presence and all of the questions tied to his being at our diner were disrupting this otherwise great arrangement that I felt I had. It seemed right in the moment to stand at the very edge of my bravery and say something to him. Of course, now that he was gone, I just felt worse. The next week, I was invited to something pretty interesting at work. I generally have a good amount of visibility into what Melanie, boss lady, does on a daily basis. The only element that remained elusive was her bi-weekly check-in with a particularly sharp-dressed agent-looking fella. There was a pretty consistent presence of state troopers, agents, and similarly uniformed men and women dropping into the diner, though I seldom paid it mind beyond simply noticing it. Midway through wiping down the tables, only an hour or so into my shift, Mel swung by and said, "Hey, want you in the meeting with the big boss. If you have a few, the big boss." Sure. Yeah. Coming. Just, if you don't mind me asking, who is? She let her eyes speak her unwritten rules to me. Questions equals generally bad. Thank you for the reminder, ma'am. We maneuvered to a back room and sat at a table. Across from us, already seated, was a man in a sharply tailored suit with a subtle earpiece in the aforementioned agent. The table was littered with a small, messy stack of notes, papers, and documents. He made it a point to size me up, staring me down uninterrupted, like a deer to headlights, no concern at all about how awkward he was making it for me. Then he turned to Melanie. "How long she been here?" he asked her in his gruff Western drawl. 6 months, she said. "You trust her?" "I trust her." "Yes." He let his eyebrows say, "If you say so," then went on with it. "All right, so apparently you had a visit from the wandering man last week. You," he said, motioning to Melanie, "were out. But you," attention now shifted to me, "weren't. Give me the lowdown, the wandering man?" The agent caught the confusion in my eyes. "Jesus, you've told this girl nothing, haven't you?" He said to Melanie. "Sir, I know it sounds weird," she said, "but I personally feel as if the man is almost, I don't know, drawn to curiosity. Like, maybe the less I say to those not already in the know, the bet, wandering man," the agent cut her off, "is our nickname for the fella that sits in the corner of your fine little establishment. Or should I say, the state's fine little establishment." "I'm sorry?" I asked. "That's correct. The state's. Congratulations. Ma'am, you're part of a government operation. The wandering man, not just a cutesy little nickname, but our legal definition of this tricky little problem, is a phenomenon we discovered many years ago. At the time, he just walked the desert landscape, chatting up unsuspecting strangers with bizarre questions. Everything fine, all hunky-dory. A little weird, sure, but nothing illegal. However, sometimes things would happen because of him. Bizarre things. Grisly things. I could see Melanie groaning, concerned at the picture being painted. Would this pique my curiosity? Have you guys yet taken him in for? I almost wanted to cut off my own stupid question, but he ran with it. Nope. Not because we don't want to, but rather because it might not be safe. The cozy mental image I'd held of this diner was starting to fracture. "We have reason to believe that he's a visitor," he said. "From?" I didn't attend another debrief after that. Not because I was barred, mind you. Rather, I just didn't want to know anymore. My gut no longer held curiosity. There was just a low, aching dread there now. The agents and troopers spaced out and seated amongst the eatery were now just a glaring reminder of what my dingy diner job really was. The government cavalry would mostly show up around the end-of-month window the wandering man was set to arrive in. When he'd appear, they wouldn't do much more than examine him from their distant tables, subtly scribbling notes into notebooks. He'd always act the same. He would just sit there. He wouldn't give them, or us the diner employees, much to go on. Speaking of employees, I remembered something Melanie told me after my first month of working here, that the worker turnover at this diner was incredibly high. Knowing at the time what everyone got paid, it made absolutely no sense to me. Now, 7 months into the gig, alongside a completely new set of cooks, waiters, and waitresses from when I'd first started, I'd seen firsthand just how true her statement was. None of the leavers claimed as much, but I'm sure the underlying premise of who the diner was really for became subconsciously clear to them during their time here. And it probably didn't sit all too well with them. I stayed, but not because of the pay. I'm actually not sure why I did. We had a new cast of rookie employees now, the ones who understood the vague terms of the situation, just as Melanie, I, and all former employees did, stuck around. Those who couldn't reconcile the situation with their inherent curiosity naturally filtered out. And then there was Malcolm. It was only his first week. He was a keener. Mega keener. He'd bulldozed through a giant list of tasks and was already asking for the next batch of work to chew through. Anything he could get ahead of, anything he could step in for, anything he could learn, he was on it. He wanted to be as helpful as humanly possible. I think the salary of the role, for a guy his young age, was just too alluring for him. For our part, Melanie and I tried our best to get him to pace himself. We were both giving the spiel now. By this point, we'd more or less perfected it. There are things about this diner that are strange. Rules you will have to follow and not think about. Rules that are concrete, immutable, and non-negotiable, like gravity, he nodded. At that moment, I really believed he was internalizing my words. And if that doesn't work for you, and if you don't think you can take care of yourself, then you shouldn't work here, I continued. There was always a visceral feeling in my stomach whenever I saw the wandering man in the corner during the same week that we were onboarding new staff. I'm sure Melanie felt it too. On those days, Mel and I would both work the till, and if we saw anyone coming out from the back, we'd stop them with a simple grab of the arm. Malcolm stepped out, and I did just that, a rough grasp of his forearm, just like Melanie had done to me when I'd first started. He recoiled in surprise. "Remember that little chat about rules we just had?" I said. He nodded meekly, as if he was already in trouble. I pointed to the man seated at the far table in the brown corduroy shirt, staring straight ahead with what I believed at the time no real reason to be here, and I said, "You'll not, under any conditions, serve that man. Don't go up to him. Don't talk to him. Pretend he doesn't exist." Malcolm lifted the garbage bag he was holding in his left hand. In my nervousness, I hadn't actually clocked what he was stepping out for. "Just doing garbage duty, ma'am," he said. But understood, and then he left out the front door with his usual swagger. The dumpster wasn't as close as we would have liked, so I appreciated his willingness to take on this duty so soon into his employment. I turned back to observe the wandering man. We had a crowd of agents in attendance that day, scattered about the restaurant. The man wasn't one to speak up often. Today was an interesting exception. "Officers," he said, "if you have any questions, feel free to join me at the table to ask them." The agents around the room reacted mainly with snickers. "Seriously, if you come sit with me, I'll be happy to spill it all." Truly, even more laughs. but no one bit. And yet he continued, pointedly, "I know you're curious. I know you take notes. I know you talk about me. I know you built this establishment for me. I know you," as I reconciled the fact that this was the most words I'd ever heard him string together in succession. I heard the chime of the bell. A door had opened. Malcolm was dusting his hands as he entered through the diner's side door. A door which was situated right beside the table the wandering man was seated at. It all happened so fast. And yet it played out in front of me excruciatingly slowly, as if there was a moment, a single solitary second, where I could have stepped in. The wandering man dropped any pretext of an exchange with the agents, stopping his sentence midway and adopting a completely new demeanor. He played the role of a low, miserable, tired man and said, 30 visits, terrible service every time, in a pathetic tone just as Malcolm walked by. Malcolm instinctively plucked a notepad out from his chest pocket and turned his head to face the man. "Hey, I get you, Chief. I can have him ring something up for you. What are you?" And then Malcolm froze in place, and the wandering man's expression turned Cheshire cat wide. His neck alternated between tensing and fluttering with what seemed to be undeniable excitement. The man started getting up from the table, and then immediately both of them were gone. Malcolm and the wanderer had vanished out of existence entirely. The insanity of the moment was interrupted by the coded language I heard blared over megaphone, nonsensical agent speak that has been seared into my memory forever. Alert level black. Wandering target has compromised a civilian. I repeat, civilian has been compromised, and that was that. Melanie quit in the days after. She wasn't mad at me. She told me she always knew she'd leave after the 10th disappearance. Why that specific milestone was required, I have no clue. All I could do from that point was continue to work. On my commutes home, or during lunch breaks, I would look up at the stars and put out the wish that Malcolm be brought back home, back from wherever he'd been taken. The debrief with the agents brought me no solace. The exchange with them was simple and short. Where was he taken to? Answered with, "He's gone now, with a perpetual dagger in my soul now." I had only the smallest of silver linings, if you can even call it that. A lesson. The lesson that I needed to be even more watchful, even more diligent. And on days when the wandering man was visiting the only server at the diner. No exceptions. I knew the agents weren't happy about that. None of them said it to me explicitly, but I could tell that they would learn something new about him every time he whisked someone away after a mistake was made. It was a weird Darwinian setup they had created. We were a zoo they could use to learn more about a specific animal, a specific entity, a specific visitor. No dice. They just have to watch him sit now, or wait for him to do something different. I waited for the 3-day stretch at the end of the month that he usually appears in. Things were quiet up until that point. When he finally showed up, it wasn't what I expected. For the first time ever, I saw the wandering man walk right through the front door. In the dead of night, at the tail end of my shift, I was at the till paralyzed as he took step after step to close the distance. And then he was right there, standing in front of me, and I was sure, absolutely sure, that I was going to die. He smiled. "Don't worry. I have my own little set of rules I play by," he said. I didn't say a word. This was no man's land right now. I know you've been curious about me. I've admired it from the moment you first spoke up to address me. Cautious curiosity is a great thing to see in someone, especially in such a reckless species. Please just go. I'd like to answer a question about why I'm visiting. I'm sure you'd like to know why I'm here, right? I'm not curious anymore. I swear I'm not." He laughed. The answer is really painfully simple. This little game, this little charade I'm playing, it is just so unbelievably fun. Please don't kill me. Please. You truly have a wonderful planet. I will return again soon. Promise. Give me a month, maybe two this time, a sincere, kind smile delivered with kind eyes. I'll come back with a new game, and then he was gone. It took me a minute to realize that there was a cake box sitting on the counter beside me. Maybe it was there the whole time he was speaking to me. Maybe it materialized right after he left. I opened the box to find Malcolm's severed head, a blank expression on his face, sitting on a bed of poorly and confusingly organized flowers. Almost as if there was an intention to create a floral arrangement, but no understanding of what something like that would look like. On top of the horrific display, written in an almost childlike handwriting, was a note that read, "I brought him back, just like you wished. The worst thing about being trapped at a diner in the middle of nowhere is that you realize that there really is nowhere else to run to. Every single part of our planet is blanketed by stars, by open sky. Someone could drop in any time."